Good afternoon, everybody. It is lovely to be back. My name is Mabel van Oranje, and as you might know, I'm a former co-chair of ECFR, and I am currently a chair emeritus. And I'm really, really excited to facilitate this conversation with George Soros, who, as you all know, is the man who played an absolutely crucial role in the creation of ECFR. And before I hand the floor to him, I wanted to just maybe draw attention to one or two of the features that I find so amazing of George. Because George is somebody who is always ahead of the curve. He often sees things long before the general public actually realizes that they're happening. And I am thinking, for example, about the fact that he recognized the economic crisis of 2008. He saw it coming before it even hit. But also I'm thinking about an issue that has really been close to his heart for more than 20 years now, I think, which is criminal justice reform in the United States. And he's been working on for more than 20 years on this. And it is really good to see that that is finally getting much more attention, as it really deserves. Get us closer to home. Let us get us to Europe. And one of these things that I've seen George do time and time again in Europe is something that also really characterizes, and that is standing up for the underdog. And I saw him first do that in the early 90s when we were working on the war in the Balkans. But I've seen him do that also, for example, in the case of the Roma and other minorities all over Europe, refugees, etc. So with a man who's always willing to pick a good fight, to stand up for what is right, and to see ahead far sooner than many of us can see, I'm really, really keen to hear from him what is on his mind and where he thinks we should all be going. George, let me give you the floor. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. We live in a revolutionary moment in history. At times like these, the range of possibilities is far greater than in normal times. Events that are inconceivable in normal times not only become possible, but actually happen. I have developed an entire conceptual framework based on the twin pillars of fallibility and reflexivity to deal with situations like the present. That's what has allowed me to make a fortune in the financial markets. In the very first days of January of this year, I realized that we had entered a global crisis that would change the direction of history. That's when Iranian General Soleimani was assassinated in Iraq. That told me that countries were more interested in fighting each other than in fighting climate change. As you know, climate change is a global problem, and it requires global cooperation to bring it under control. Then came the novel coronavirus that thoroughly disrupted people's lives and added yet another global problem. What direction will history take? That's a question nobody can answer, because the future depends on decisions that have not yet been taken. Nevertheless, I believe my Open Society foundations are well situated to develop strategies to make the world a better place. I personally have focused on areas where I have experience and a historical background. That led me to two particular issues that are of global significance. One is the plan for the International Monetary Fund to issue a new round of special drawing rights and to persuade rich countries to donate their allocations, which they don't need, to poor countries that are desperate for them. To explain the idea better, special drawing rights are synthetic money created by the IMF. SDRs are allocated in accordance with the member countries' shareholding in the IMF. Rich countries don't need them because they can issue money in their own name in the international markets. The capacity of poor countries to do so is extremely limited. That's why it's so important for rich countries to donate their allocations to poor ones. As regards historical
I am not sure if we have a technical difficulty, whether we have lost George, the connection with George. I'm afraid we have lost the connection with George, so hopefully he will soon come back in and reconnect. So please be patient. And I'm sorry, as I'm using different technology, we might have George back here.
Hold on, George.
There you are, George.
There you
are.
Yeah.
George, you're back. We are reconnected.
Very good. So, nevertheless, enthusiastically endorsed the idea and argued that the best and perhaps only way to raise 1 or 2 trillion euros is by issuing perpetual bonds. The distinguishing feature of perpetual bonds is that the principal never has to be repaid. Only the annual interest is due. This makes them very efficient. They have a cost-benefit ratio that is almost 10 times greater than that of the long-term bonds that the Commission is proposing to use. This sounds almost unbelievable, but it's true. assuming 0.5% interest, which is quite generous in the current low interest rate environment, 1 trillion euros would cost only 5 billion annually. The interest would have to be paid forever, but the present value of future payments diminishes progressively until it approaches but doesn't quite reach zero. Most importantly, perpetual bonds could be issued as soon as member states authorize sufficient own resources to maintain the AAA rating of the European Union. Own resources would come from newly authorized taxes, such as a tax on carbon emissions. The taxes would only have to be authorized. They wouldn't need to be imposed because that would take too long, and speed is of paramount importance. The perpetual bonds don't need to be issued in one go. They could be sold in tranches. The first tranches would be snatched up by insurance companies and other long-term investors who are starved of assets to match their liabilities. As the market familiarizes themselves with the new instrument, other investors would be attracted to it. And as the bond market, as the bonds became actively traded, the European Central Bank would also be allowed to invest in them. There is an important distinction between funds raised from the EU's own resources and those that are contributed by member states. The latter have to be distributed to member states according to their shareholding in the European Central Bank. The former can be given by the Commission to those who are most in need. That makes all the difference to the effectiveness of the aid that the European Union can provide. For instance, it could assist those who have lost their livelihood because of the virus. Currently, they have to depend on their own governments whose capacities vary. It would be much more equitable if the support came from the European Union. Why did member states ignore so studiously an instrument that is ideally suited to the current situation? They were aware of perpetual bonds because Spain championed them at a virtual summit of the European Council on April 23rd, and they were listed as one of the ideas that deserved further consideration. My guess is that the perpetual bonds were dismissed out of hand because they were confused with corona bonds. The latter were decisively rejected by member states because some of them were unwilling to go that far. In reality, perpetual bonds are the exact opposite of corona bonds. Perpetual bonds reduce the debt burden. Corona bonds increase it. To avoid confusion, I now try to avoid using the term perpetual bonds. I prefer to use the word consols. That's the name the UK and the US used for centuries to describe perpetual bonds. The UK started in 1752 and the US in the 1870s. Interestingly, the Netherlands predated the other two countries. A Dutch water board issued perpetual bonds in 1648 to repair a dike. The bonds are still outstanding, but the annual interest has become so small that the general public is not even aware of their continued existence. As far as I know, the Dutch actually invented the idea, yet today they are the most ardent opponent. They are the leaders of the so-called Frugal Four. In 1648, the Netherlands faced a serious threat from flooding. Today, the combination of the virus and climate change poses an even greater danger to the European Union. It would be tragic if Europe in general, and the Frugal Four in particular, failed to give consols the consideration they deserve. I recognize that there are bound to be legal objections based on the TFEU that contains all the rules that govern the European Union. I believe the objections could be overcome by arguing that the authors of the TFEU were not aware of the existence of consols. Therefore, its regulations doesn't apply to them. I also anticipate moral objections from German-speaking people. The German word Schuld has a double meaning, debt and guilt. It follows that debtors should be punished. That makes perpetual bonds that never have to be repaid morally inadmissible. There is one legitimate objection that may be raised. Once you start using consoles, you may end up abusing them. But the fact that the large-scale use of Europe's AAA credit is already designated as a temporary measure, that should be that should ensure that they would not be used in normal times. They offer a financial tool ideally suited to the current circumstances, and they would not be abused in normal times. So why all this hostility? I believe the answer is to be found in the sequence of events. The Commission was not aware of perpetual bonds when it proposed a recovery plan. It was relying on the only instrument over which it had some control, namely the budget. That focused the attention of member states and interest groups on how the funds are distributed, not on how they were generated. Interested parties are now haggling with each other. For instance, the Frugal Four want to protect their discounts from their contributions to the budget. It will take time for the authorities to realize that the budget can generate the amount of money the European Union needs. That's when the consoles will be recognized as an indispensable financial instrument. But by that time, it may be too late. We must therefore accelerate the process. The money is needed now. The German presidency starting on July 1st is the ideal occasion for a breakthrough. Chancellor Merkel is focused on making it a great success, and she has fully recovered her political influence. She also has capable supporters in the Ministry of Finance who understand the merits of consoles. In addition to dealing with the virus, consoles should also be used to address climate change. Recently, a strong movement has developed to raise the 2030 climate target from 40% to 55%. A number of mainly East European countries are objecting that they didn't have enough money to meet the higher target. That could be readily remedied with an additional €1 trillion of consoles. Of course, the Commission would have to carefully monitor that the funds are not misdirected and misused. In this way, the European Union could meet the two great challenges of our time and fulfill the expectations of its citizens. That would be a truly great accomplishment. Thank you.